Dr. Trisha Coronacion adjusted her worn leather satchel as she stepped into the cramped municipal building that housed Millbrook's tax auction. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of folding chairs occupied by a handful of locals who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. At 34, Trisha carried herself with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to make every dollar stretch. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her clothes, a simple blouse and dark slacks, that had seen better days, spoke of someone who worked with her hands and couldn't afford to care about fashion. The past 18 months had been a series of rejections and closed doors. Despite her PhD in botany from the University of the Philippines and 3 years of postdoctoral research, tenure-track positions had proven as elusive as rain in a drought. The academic job market had no patience for someone whose research focused on integrating traditional Filipino plant medicine with Western botanical science. Too unconventional for conservative departments, too academic for alternative medicine practitioners. She'd found herself caught between worlds with student loans mounting and savings dwindling. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That's what had brought her to this forgotten corner of upstate New York, where land was cheap and desperate people made desperate choices. Millbrook was the kind of town that existed in the spaces between more important places, sustained by a few remaining farms and the stubborn refusal of its residents to admit that their best days were behind them. It was exactly the sort of place where someone like Trisha might be able to afford a small plot of land for her planned herbal medicine practice. The auctioneer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice that suggested he'd rather be selling insurance, cleared his throat and began the proceedings. Next item, lot number 47, a 1.3-acre cleared parcel on Old Mill Road, formerly owned by the Henderson estate. Taxes delinquent for 3 years, total amount due $47.50. Trisha straightened in her chair. This was exactly what she'd been hoping for, small, affordable, and already cleared for cultivation. She'd driven by the property yesterday and found it unremarkable. A roughly circular clearing surrounded by second-growth forest, accessible by a narrow dirt road that branched off from the main highway. Perfect for someone who needed to start small and build slowly. Opening bid is 60 cents, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who'd conducted too many of these sales. Several hands went up around the room. Trisha raised hers as well, noting the other bidders with the practiced eye of someone who'd attended enough of these auctions to recognize the types. There was an elderly farmer in overalls who probably wanted the land for hay production, a middle-aged woman who looked like she flipped properties for a living, and 2 men in business suits who radiated the confident air of developers looking for cheap acreage. $1, the auctioneer called. Do I hear 150? The bidding continued in the predictable pattern Trisha had observed at previous auctions. The serious buyers would let the small-timers establish a baseline before making their real moves. She waited, calculating how much she could actually afford to spend. Her savings account held exactly $847, and she'd need most of that for building materials and supplies if she managed to win any property today. But then something strange happened. As the bidding approached $5, one of the men in suits leaned forward and whispered something urgent to his companion. Both men immediately lowered their hands and began gathering their papers with obvious haste. The property flipper followed their example moments later, her face pale and suddenly anxious. The elderly farmer held out until the bidding reached $8, before he too withdrew with a shake of his head that seemed more fearful than frustrated. Going once at 60 cents, the auctioneer said, his voice betraying no surprise at the sudden exodus. Going twice. Trisha looked around the nearly empty room, confused but not willing to question her good fortune. This was exactly the kind of break she needed, sold to the young lady in the 3rd row for 60 cents. As she walked forward to complete the paperwork, Trisha heard fragments of whispered conversation from the remaining spectators. "Another outsider who doesn't know," someone muttered. "Should have warned her," came another voice, followed by a sharp "hush" that effectively ended all discussion. Margaret Henley approached as Trisha signed the deed transfer documents. The older woman was perhaps 70, with silver hair and the kind of careful posture that suggested a lifetime spent among books. Her clothes were well made but dated, giving her the appearance of someone who'd once held a position of respect in the community. "My dear," Margaret said quietly, "I don't mean to interfere, but are you quite certain about this purchase?" Trisha looked up from the paperwork, noting the genuine concern in the woman's pale blue eyes. "Is there something wrong with the property? Structural issues? Environmental problems?" Margaret's hands fluttered nervously over the handle of her purse. "Nothing like that exactly. It's just that the land has a history. People in town, well, they tend to avoid that particular piece of property." "What kind of history?" Trisha asked, though she continued signing documents as she spoke. Whatever superstitions or local gossip surrounded the land, she couldn't afford to let 60 cents worth of property slip away because of small-town folklore. "There have been incidents over the years," Margaret said carefully. "People who went onto that land alone, especially after dark. Some of them never came back. Others returned changed, speaking of things that couldn't possibly be true. The Henderson family owned it for 40 years and never once set foot on the property themselves. They claimed it was too difficult to access, but that's not really true. The road is perfectly serviceable." The auctioneer cleared his throat impatiently. "Ma'am, if you're having second thoughts, there are other interested parties." Trisha glanced back at the nearly empty room and doubted that assertion, but she completed the final signature anyway. "Thank you for the warning, Mrs. Henley, Margaret Henley. I was the town librarian for 37 years before I retired." The older woman hesitated, then pressed a business card into Trisha's hand. "If you decide to go through with this, please be careful. And if you find anything unusual about the property, anything at all, please come see me at the library. There are things about this town's history that aren't written in the official records." Driving toward her new property an hour later, Trisha reflected on the morning's strange turn of events. She'd expected to pay at least $50 for any decent piece of land, even at a tax auction. Instead, she'd acquired 1.3 acres for less than the cost of a cup of coffee, despite initial interest from several other bidders. The sudden withdrawal of those bidders bothered her more than Margaret Henley's warnings. Superstition she could dismiss, but the nervous behavior of people who made their living from real estate suggested there might be practical concerns she wasn't aware of. The dirt road leading to her property was indeed in better condition than Margaret had implied the previous owners claimed. The gravel surface was well maintained, and the route through the forest was clearly marked. Ancient maples and oaks formed a canopy overhead, filtering the afternoon sunlight into a dappled pattern that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. But there was something oppressive about the silence under those trees, an absence of birdsong and insect noise that seemed unnatural for a healthy forest in late spring. The clearing itself appeared exactly as she remembered from her quick drive-by the day before. Roughly circular, perhaps 200 feet across, with good southern exposure and rich-looking soil. A few scattered stones suggested there might once have been structures here, but nothing remained except low grass and the occasional wildflower. The surrounding forest pressed close on all sides, creating a sense of enclosure that was both protective and slightly claustrophobic. Trisha parked her battered Honda Civic at the edge of the clearing and stepped out into the afternoon air. The silence was even more pronounced here, broken only by the distant hum of traffic from the main road. She walked slowly around the perimeter, making mental notes about drainage, soil composition, and sun exposure. Everything looked perfect for her planned medicinal herb garden. Too perfect, perhaps, for land that had sold for 60 cents at a tax auction. She was so absorbed in her survey that she almost missed the figure standing at the forest's edge. A tall man with weathered features and long grey hair watched her from beneath the shadow of an enormous oak tree. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt, but something about his posture suggested he belonged to this landscape in a way that she never would. Their eyes met across the clearing, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon temperature. Before she could call out a greeting or question, the man melted back into the forest with the silent grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime moving through wild places. Trisha stood alone in her clearing, suddenly aware that the silence around her was not peaceful but watchful, as if the land itself was taking her measure and finding her wanting. Trisha returned to the clearing at dawn the following morning, armed with soil sampling kits, measuring tape, and a field notebook that had survived 3 years of graduate research. The early morning light revealed details she'd missed the previous afternoon, and what she found defied everything she knew about forest ecology. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The plant life within the clearing followed patterns that shouldn't exist in nature. Where she'd expected the random distribution of pioneer species typical of abandoned agricultural land, she found instead geometric arrangements that seemed almost deliberate. Clusters of wild bergamot formed perfect pentagons around scattered oak saplings. Wild ginger grew in precise spirals radiating out from the clearing's center. Most unsettling of all, she discovered species that had no business thriving in this climate. Tropical plants that should have died with the first frost, Arctic flora that required months of winter dormancy, and desert succulents that should have rotted in the region's humid summers. Her soil thermometer registered temperatures that varied wildly across the clearing. Near the geometric plant formations, the ground was warm to the touch, sometimes reaching temperatures that should have killed the root systems of the plants growing there. Yet the vegetation not only survived, but appeared to be thriving with an unnatural vigor that made her question her own observations. Trisha methodically documented each anomaly, photographing the unusual plant arrangements and recording soil temperatures that ranged from nearly freezing to uncomfortably warm within the space of a few feet. Her scientific training demanded careful observation and detailed record-keeping, but her growing unease made her frequently glance toward the surrounding forest, watching for any sign of the mysterious observer from the previous day. As the morning wore on, she became aware of other oddities. The silence she'd noted yesterday wasn't complete. There were sounds, but they were wrong somehow. Bird calls that didn't match any species she knew, insect buzzing that seemed to come from underground, and occasionally, very faintly, what sounded almost like human voices speaking in a language she couldn't identify. Her work was interrupted by the arrival of a pickup truck that parked beside her Honda. A woman emerged, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to outdoor work. She was perhaps 45, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of tan that spoke of years spent in the sun. Her clothes were practical, work boots, jeans, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. "You must be the new owner," the woman said, extending a calloused hand. "I'm Linda Morrison. My farm borders your property on the east side." Trisha shook the offered hand, grateful for human contact after hours of increasingly strange observations. "Trisha Coronacion. I'm hoping to establish a medicinal herb garden here." Linda's expression grew serious. "You picked an interesting piece of land for that." She gestured toward the geometric plant formations. "I've been watching this clearing for 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what's growing here now." "What do you mean?" Trisha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Those patterns weren't there last spring. Hell, half of those plants weren't there last spring. "I know this area like the back of my hand, and I can tell you that some of what you've got growing here doesn't belong in this part of the world." Linda paused, studying Trisha's face carefully. "The question is whether you planted them or they just appeared on their own." "I only bought the property yesterday," Trisha said. "This is my first real look at what's here." Linda nodded slowly. "That's what I figured. Which means We've got a bigger mystery on our hands than I thought." She pointed toward a cluster of broad-leafed plants near the clearing's center. "Those are breadfruit leaves. I spent 2 years in Hawaii when I was younger, and I'd know them anywhere. But breadfruit can't survive a New York winter. They can't even survive New York fall weather." Trisha knelt beside the plants Linda had indicated, her excitement overriding her apprehension. The leaves were indeed from Artocarpus altilis, a tropical species she'd studied extensively in graduate school. But Linda was absolutely right. These plants should have been killed by the first frost, which had occurred less than 6 months ago, according to local weather records. "There's something else," Linda continued, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "People around here avoid this clearing, especially after sunset. They say things happen here that can't be explained. Disappearances, strange lights, voices in the night. Most folks think it's just superstition, but I've seen enough to know there's something unusual about this place." As if summoned by her words, a figure emerged from the forest on the clearing's far side. It was the same man Trisha had glimpsed the day before, but now she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 60, with long grey hair braided down his back and features that suggested Native American ancestry. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness, but his eyes held a wariness that seemed focused entirely on Trisha. Linda followed her gaze and stiffened. "That's Thomas Crowfeather. He's been watching over this land for as long as anyone can remember, though nobody's quite sure why. He doesn't talk to outsiders much, but he might make an exception for someone who seems genuinely interested in understanding this place." Thomas approached slowly, his dark eyes taking in Trisha's equipment and notes. When he spoke, his voice was deep and measured, carrying the weight of someone who chose his words carefully. "You're documenting the changes," he said. "It wasn't a question. I'm trying to understand what's happening here," Trisha replied. "The plant life doesn't follow normal ecological patterns." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Most people see only what they expect to see. You notice what's actually there." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. But observation alone won't be enough. This land has depths that scientific instruments can't measure. Before Trisha could ask what he meant, Thomas turned and walked back toward the forest. At the tree line he paused and called back to her. "Be careful after sunset. Dr. Coronacion, some knowledge comes at a price. And this land has a long memory for those who've wronged it." The fact that he knew her title sent a chill down her spine. She was certain she'd never met him before, and she'd been careful not to use her academic credentials when introducing herself around town. Linda was frowning as Thomas disappeared into the trees. "That's more than I've ever heard him say at one time. Usually, he just watches and listens. The fact that he spoke to you at all is significant. How did he know I was a doctor?" Trisha asked. "Thomas knows things about people that he shouldn't be able to know. Some folks say he's got second sight. Others think he just pays very close attention to details the rest of us miss." Linda glanced at the sky, noting the sun's position. "It's getting on toward afternoon. If you're smart, you'll finish up your work and be gone before sunset. Whatever's going on with this land, it seems to get more active once the sun goes down." Trisha spent the rest of the afternoon completing her initial survey, but Linda's warning and Thomas's cryptic comments weighed heavily on her mind. As the shadows began to lengthen, she felt an increasingly urgent need to leave the clearing. It wasn't conscious fear exactly, but rather a deep, instinctive unease that seemed to emanate from the land itself. She packed her equipment with growing haste, trying to ignore the way the geometric plant formations seemed to shift and blur in her peripheral vision. The warm soil beneath her feet began to feel almost hot, and the strange sounds she'd been hearing all day grew more distinct and unsettling. By the time she reached her car, her hands were shaking with an adrenaline response she couldn't rationally justify. Driving away from the clearing as the sun touched the horizon, Trisha found herself gripping the steering wheel tightly and fighting the urge to look back. In her rearview mirror, She caught a glimpse of lights moving among the trees, not electric lights, but something softer and more organic, like bioluminescence or foxfire. She pressed harder on the accelerator and didn't slow down until the main highway put, several miles between herself and her mysterious new property, the Millbrook. Public library occupied a converted Victorian mansion on the town's main street, its Gothic revival architecture suggesting better times when the community could afford such ambitious civic projects. Trisha climbed the front steps the next morning with Margaret Henley's business card in her hand and questions multiplying in her mind. Like the geometric plant formations, she couldn't stop thinking about. Margaret looked up from a cart of books. She was shelving, her face showing a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Dr. Coronacion, I wondered if you might come by. How was your first visit to the property?" "Confusing," Trisha admitted. "And I'm hoping you might be able to help me understand some of what I'm seeing there." Margaret set down the book she'd been holding and gestured toward a reading area, furnished with comfortable chairs and good lighting. "What exactly did you observe?" Trisha described the geometric plant arrangements, the tropical species thriving in a temperate climate, and the varying soil temperatures that defied explanation. She also mentioned her brief encounters with Linda Morrison and Thomas Crow Feather, noting Thomas's apparent knowledge of her background and his warning about the land's long memory. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. When Trisha finished, the older woman sat quietly for several minutes, clearly struggling with internal conflict. "Before I share what I know," Margaret finally said, "I need you to understand that much of what I'm about to tell you isn't documented in official records. These are family stories, passed down through generations, and there are people in this town who would prefer that they remain private." "I'm not looking to cause trouble," Trisha assured her. "I just want to understand what I've gotten myself into." Margaret stood and walked to a filing cabinet that looked older than the building itself. From it, she withdrew a manila folder thick with yellowed newspaper clippings, hand-drawn maps, and what appeared to be personal correspondence. "My great-grandfather, Edmund Henley, was one of Millbrook's founding fathers," she began, spreading the documents across the reading table. He kept detailed records of the town's early years, including events that later residents preferred to forget. The oldest document was a surveyor's map dated 1847, showing the area that would become Millbrook. Trisha's property was clearly marked, but with a notation that made her blood run cold: "Sacred ground, Seneca Nation, not suitable for settlement." The indigenous people who lived here before European settlement considered that clearing sacred, Margaret explained. "According to my great-grandfather's journals, it was used for spiritual ceremonies and healing rituals." The Seneca believed that the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin there, making it a place of power. Margaret pulled out a newspaper clipping from 1851. The headline read, "Local. Landowner reports missing survey team." The article described the disappearance of 3 men who had been hired to prepare Trisha's property for development. They had been seen entering the clearing on a Tuesday morning and never emerged. Search parties found no trace of them, though their equipment was discovered arranged in what witnesses described as unnatural patterns at the clearing's center. "This is just the first of many such incidents," Margaret said, producing more clippings spanning the decades. "The pattern is always the same. People enter the clearing alone, especially after dark, and either disappear entirely or return, claiming to have experienced things that couldn't possibly be true." Trisha studied a clipping from 1923, describing a local farmer who had attempted to clear the land for planting. He'd been found 3 days later, wandering the forest in a confused state, insisting that he'd spoken with dead relatives and witnessed events from the past as if they were happening in the present. "But the most troubling incident," Margaret continued, pulling out a folder marked "Confidential" in her great-grandfather's handwriting, occurred in 1872. By then, the town council had decided that something had to be done about the clearing. The disappearances were discouraging settlement, and there were rumors that the surviving Seneca were somehow involved. The documents in the confidential folder told a story that made Trisha's stomach turn. A group of local leaders, including Edmund Henley, had arranged what they described as a final solution to the problem. They had invited representatives of the local Seneca community to a peace meeting in the clearing, ostensibly to negotiate compensation for the sacred site. It was a trap, Margaret whispered, her voice thick with shame. They murdered everyone who came to that meeting. Men, women, spiritual leaders, 17 people in total. They buried the bodies in the clearing and spread stories that the Seneca had moved west to join relatives in other territories. Trisha stared at the documents, trying to process the magnitude of the crime Margaret was describing. This is evidence of mass murder. Why was nothing ever done about it? Because the people responsible were the town's founding fathers. They controlled the government, the businesses, everything. They covered up the massacre and created a different version of history where the land's problems were caused by natural phenomena or lingering spiritual influence rather than their own crimes. Margaret showed her more documents, official reports that attributed the clearing's strange phenomena to magnetic anomalies, gas leaks, or psychological suggestion. Each explanation carefully avoided any mention of the murders that had taken place there. But the disappearances didn't stop after the massacre, Margaret continued. If anything, they became more frequent and more targeted. People who asked too many questions about the clearing's history. Individuals who showed too much interest in local Native American culture. Anyone who might potentially uncover the truth. They all seemed to have unfortunate accidents or simply vanished. A soft cough from behind them made both women turn. Dr. James Whitmore stood near the library's entrance, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expensive suit suggesting wealth and authority. He was, perhaps, 55, with the kind of confident bearing that came from a lifetime of having others defer to his judgment. "Margaret," he said pleasantly, "I see you're sharing our local folklore with your new neighbor." There was something in his tone that made Trisha immediately wary. This wasn't casual friendliness, but rather the careful politeness of a predator assessing potential prey. "Dr. Whitmore," Margaret replied stiffly, "I was just helping Dr. Coronacion understand some of the history surrounding her new property." How wonderful. Local history can be so fascinating, though of course it's important to distinguish between documented facts and colorful legends. Dr. Whitmore moved closer to the table, his eyes scanning the documents Margaret had spread out. "I do hope you're not filling Dr. Coronacion's head with our more imaginative local tales. The documents speak for themselves," Trisha said firmly, sensing that this man represented some kind of threat to her investigation. Dr. Whitmore's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew cold. "Oh, I'm sure they do. Though as a man of science myself, I've learned to be skeptical of century-old papers that can't be independently verified. So much of what passes for historical fact is really just gossip written down by people with their own agendas." He leaned over the table, his presence making both women unconsciously lean back. "For instance, some of these documents suggest rather serious accusations against respected members of our community's founding families. The kind of accusations that could cause real harm to innocent descendants if they were taken seriously by the wrong people." Margaret's hands were trembling as she began gathering the documents. "Perhaps this isn't the best time for this discussion?" "On the contrary," Dr. Whitmore said smoothly. "I think this is exactly the right time. Dr. Coronacion, isn't it? I understand you recently acquired the old Henderson property. Congratulations on such an economical purchase." "Thank you," Trisha said carefully. "I hope you'll find it suitable for your needs. Though I should mention that several members of our community have expressed concern about development in that particular area. Environmental issues, you understand. Soil contamination, potential archaeological significance, the sorts of complications that could make any project there quite expensive." and legally problematic. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Dr. Whitmore was warning her away from both the land and the historical investigation. Margaret had begun. Of course, he continued, if the property proves unsuitable for your purposes, I'd be happy to facilitate a sale to one of our local conservation groups. We could easily arrange for you to recoup your investment, perhaps even turn a small profit. Sometimes the most economical choice is also the wisest one. Trisha met his gaze directly. I appreciate the offer, but I'm quite satisfied with my purchase. Dr. Whitmore's smile grew strained. Well, that's your choice, naturally. Though I do hope you'll be careful up there. That property has a history of accidents. It would be terrible if our newest resident were to experience any unfortunate mishaps while exploring her new land. With that, he nodded politely to both women and left the library, his footsteps echoing in the Victorian building's high-ceilinged rooms. Margaret waited until the sound of his car engine faded before speaking. Dr. Whitmore's family has been one of the most influential in Millbrook for over a century. His great-great-grandfather was one of the men who organized the massacre I told you about. Trisha looked at the documents Margaret was hurriedly putting away. And he doesn't want people looking into the historical record. Dr. Whitmore has worked very hard to maintain his family's reputation and position in this community. He's not going to allow an outsider to threaten that, no matter how legitimate her interests might be. Margaret finished packing the documents and locked them back in the filing cabinet. You need to be very careful, Dr. Coronacion. The people who've tried to expose the truth about that clearing over the years have had a tendency to meet with unfortunate accidents. As Trisha left the library, she felt the weight of Dr. Whitmore's veiled threats and Margaret's warnings. But she also carried with her a growing understanding of what she'd stumbled into. The geometric plant patterns, the impossible species thriving in her clearing, the warnings from Thomas Crowfeather, they were all connected to a crime that had been covered up for 150 years. Someone had murdered 17 people in her clearing and spent generations maintaining that cover-up through intimidation and violence. The land itself seemed to remember that crime, responding to it in ways that defied scientific explanation. And now she, an outsider with no understanding of the local power structure, had accidentally acquired the site of that ancient massacre. The question was whether she had the courage to uncover a truth that others had died trying to expose, or whether Dr. Whitmore's subtle threats would succeed where the land's own mysteries had not. Within 2 days of her library visit, Trisha discovered that Dr. Whitmore's influence extended far beyond polite threats. Her first indication came when she arrived at the local hardware store to purchase basic supplies for her planned herb garden. The owner, a burly man named Pete Rawlings, refused to sell her anything. Nothing personal, Doc, Pete said, avoiding her eyes as he spoke. But I've been advised that doing business with you might not be in my best interests. At the diner where she'd been taking her meals, the waitress served her burned coffee and cold food with a barely concealed hostility that hadn't been there the day before. The motel clerk mentioned that her weekly rate had suddenly doubled due to increased demand. Even the gas station attendant watched her with suspicious eyes as she filled her Honda's tank. The message was clear: cooperate with the town's power structure, or find yourself unwelcome in Millbrook. But the passive aggression escalated to something more sinister when Trisha returned to her car after lunch to find all 4 tires slashed. Scratched into the paint on the driver's side door was a single word: leave. Subtle, she muttered, photographing the damage with her phone. The repair would cost money she couldn't afford, but backing down wasn't an option. She'd invested too much hope in this property to surrender it without understanding what she was truly fighting. That evening, as she sat in her motel room researching tire shops, Dr. Whitmore knocked on her door. He stood in the hallway with 2 companions, men who radiated the kind of controlled menace that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. "Dr. Coronacion," he said with his perpetual smile, "I heard about your automotive troubles. Vandalism is such an unfortunate reality in today's world, especially when it's orchestrated, Trisha replied, not inviting him in. Oh, I'm sure it was random. Though it does illustrate how unwelcome outsiders can feel in small communities like ours. Dr. Whitmore's companions positioned themselves on either side of the doorway, creating an intimidating presence. Which is why I wanted to renew my offer to purchase your property. I've spoken with several local conservation groups, and they're prepared to offer you $600, 10 times your investment. Quite generous, considering the complications we discussed. Trisha gripped the door handle tighter. And if I refuse, then you'll continue to experience the challenges that seem to plague that particular piece of land. Vandalism, supply shortages, permit delays, environmental concerns, the sorts of bureaucratic difficulties that can make any project impossibly expensive. His smile never wavered. Of course, there are also the more natural hazards associated with that property. The disappearances I mentioned, the accidents that seem to occur there with disturbing regularity. Are you threatening me, Dr. Whitmore? I'm offering you valuable advice based on 150 years of local experience. People who ignore that advice have a tendency to experience unfortunate consequences. He stepped back, gesturing to his companions. You have 48 hours to consider my offer. After that, I can't guarantee your safety or comfort in our community. As their footsteps faded down the motel corridor, Trisha realized she was trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. Dr. Whitmore's threats were no longer subtle, and the men who'd accompanied him suggested he was prepared to escalate beyond economic pressure, if necessary. She was reaching for her phone to call the police when a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Through the door's security viewer, she saw Thomas Crowfeather standing alone in the hallway. "May I come in?" he asked when she opened the door. "We need to talk." Thomas moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely comfortable in any environment. But his weathered face showed concern as he settled into the room's single chair. "Dr. Whitmore's people have been asking questions about you," he said without preamble. "They want to know how much you've learned, who you've spoken with, whether you represent any larger threat to their interests." "What kind of threat could I possibly represent? I'm just a botanist trying to start an herb garden. You're an outsider with scientific credentials who's asking inconvenient questions about land that's supposed to remain mysterious and dangerous. That makes you exactly the kind of person they've been eliminating for generations." Thomas leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "The disappearances Margaret told you about? Most of them weren't accidents or supernatural phenomena. They were murders designed to maintain the cover-up." Trisha felt cold despite the room's warmth. "How do you know all this?" "Because my people have been watching and remembering for 150 years. We know who was responsible for the massacre, and we know how their descendants have protected that secret. Dr. Whitmore's great-great-grandfather was one of the killers, and the family has been eliminating potential threats ever since." Thomas pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "These are the names of people who've disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances while investigating that clearing. 17 in total, spanning from 1851 to last year." Trisha scanned the list, her heart sinking as she realized the scope of the conspiracy she'd stumbled into. "Why haven't you gone to the authorities?" "Because the authorities are part of the conspiracy. The sheriff's department, the mayor's office, even the county prosecutor, they're all connected to the families that participated in the original massacre. Justice isn't possible through normal channels." Thomas stood, moving to the window to check the parking lot. "But the land chose you for a reason. The geometric patterns you found, the impossible plant species, the way the clearing responds to your presence, that's not random. The spirits of those who died there are trying to communicate with someone who might finally expose the truth. I don't understand how any of this is possible. Your Western science explains part of it. Trauma can leave lasting impressions on the environment, especially in places that were already spiritually significant. But there's more at work here than residual energy. The ceremony that was interrupted by the massacre created a protective curse that prevents the land from being exploited by those who would dishonor it further. Thomas turned back to face her. Dr. Whitmore's family has spent generations trying to find a way to neutralize that protection so they can develop the property. They've brought in geologists, archaeologists, even spiritual advisors, but the land rejects anyone connected to the original crime. So why doesn't it reject me? Because you approach it with respect and genuine curiosity, rather than the desire to exploit or control. The spirits recognize the difference, even if you don't fully understand what's happening. A car engine in the parking lot made Thomas tense. He looked out the window and swore softly. Dr. Whitmore's people are back, and they've brought more friends. You need to leave town tonight, before they decide that subtle threats aren't sufficient. Trisha's scientific mind rebelled against the supernatural elements of Thomas's explanation. But she couldn't deny the physical evidence of the conspiracy. The slashed tires, the economic pressure, Dr. Whitmore's increasingly direct threats. Someone was definitely trying to force her away from that property. If I run now, they win, she said. The truth about what happened in that clearing stays buried, and whoever killed those 17 people gets away with it. Thomas nodded approvingly. Then you understand what you're choosing. This isn't just about your herb garden anymore. You're walking the same dangerous path that got 16 other people killed. 17, Trisha corrected. You said 17 people on that list. The 17th one disappeared just last year. A graduate student in anthropology who was researching indigenous sites in the region. Her body was never found, but her car was discovered in the river with evidence suggesting she'd been forced off the road. Thomas pulled out his phone and showed her a news article. Sarah Chen. She'd been asking questions about historical sites that had been disturbed or destroyed during early settlement. Dr. Whitmore's people couldn't risk what she might discover. Trisha stared at the photograph of a young Asian woman whose determined expression reminded her of her own graduate school portraits. They killed her for researching history. They killed her because she was getting close to the truth. Just like they're preparing to kill you, Thomas pocketed his phone. Unless we can expose the conspiracy before they make their move. Despite Thomas's warnings about leaving town, Trisha found herself drawn back to the clearing the next night. She told herself it was scientific curiosity, the need to document the supernatural phenomena she'd witnessed. But deeper instincts suggested the land was calling to her in ways she couldn't rationally explain. She parked her repaired Honda at the forest's edge and approached on foot, carrying a flashlight and her field notebook. The geometric plant formations were more pronounced in the darkness, seeming to pulse with their own faint luminescence. The air felt thick and charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm, and the silence pressed against her eardrums with an almost physical weight. As the moon rose above the tree line, casting silver light across the clearing, Trisha experienced her first direct supernatural encounter. The temperature dropped suddenly, her breath becoming visible in air that had been warm moments before. The bioluminescent plants began to glow more brightly, their geometric arrangements shifting and flowing like living mandalas. Then she heard the voices. They spoke in a language she'd never encountered. But somehow the meaning reached her directly, bypassing conscious translation. The words carried emotional weight, grief, anger, and a desperate desire for justice that had persisted for 150 years. Images flashed through her mind, people in traditional dress gathering for ceremony. The arrival of armed settlers, screams cut short by gunfire, bodies falling onto ground that would remember their pain forever. Trisha staggered as the psychic assault overwhelmed her scientific skepticism. These weren't hallucinations or environmental phenomena. Something intelligent was communicating with her, sharing memories of violence and betrayal that the earth itself had absorbed and preserved. A figure materialized near the clearing center, translucent but unmistakably human. A young woman in traditional Seneca dress, her long black hair adorned with feathers and beads. She moved with ethereal grace, her feet barely touching the ground as she approached. "Running deer," Trisha whispered, the name emerging from knowledge she didn't remember acquiring. The spirit nodded, her dark eyes holding depths of sorrow that made Trisha's heart ache. When Running Deer spoke, her voice seemed to come from the ground itself, resonating through Trisha's bones rather than her ears. "You see the truth that others refuse to acknowledge. The land remembers what was stolen, what was destroyed, what was hidden beneath lies and silence." Running Deer gestured toward the geometric plant formations, which pulsed brighter in response to her presence. "We were conducting the midwinter ceremony when the killers came. The sacred fire was burning, the prayers were spoken, the boundary between worlds was thin. Our deaths at such a moment created a permanent opening, a wound in reality that cannot heal until justice is served." Trisha's practical mind struggled to process what she was experiencing. "Are you really here, or am I having some kind of breakdown? Reality has layers that your science has not yet discovered. I am here in the way that pain endures, in the way that truth persists despite attempts to bury it. Your cultural background allows you to accept what Western minds typically reject." The spirit was right. Trisha's Filipino heritage included acceptance of spiritual realities that mainstream American culture dismissed. Her grandmother had spoken of ancestors who watched over the living, of places where the past remained present for those with eyes to see. "What do you need from me?" Trisha asked. "Acknowledgement, truth-telling, the return of this sacred ground to those who understand its power." Running Deer's form flickered, becoming more solid as she spoke with greater intensity. "But first, you must survive the attempts to silence you. The families responsible for our deaths have murdered many others to protect their secret." Thomas Crowfeather told me about the list. 17 people who died trying to expose what happened here. 16, Running Deer corrected sadly. Sarah Chen, the last one, was my descendant through bloodlines she never knew existed. Her death brought me closer to your world, strengthened the connection between past and present. She speaks through me now, adding her modern knowledge to ancient wisdom. Trisha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural temperature drop. "Sarah Chen is dead, murdered last year for researching indigenous sites that had been destroyed or desecrated. Dr. Whitmore's people forced her car off the road, but her spirit joined those of us who were killed in this place. We are 17 now, united in purpose." The implications hit Trisha like physical blows. The conspiracy wasn't just historical, it was ongoing, actively eliminating threats to the cover-up. And now she'd made herself the next target by asking the same questions that had gotten Sarah Chen killed. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," she admitted. "Strength comes in many forms." Sarah had the courage of a truth-teller, but lacked allies who could protect her. "You have found Thomas, who carries the wisdom of our people, and soon you will find others who share your commitment to justice." Running Deer moved closer, her ethereal presence bringing comfort rather than fear. "Your scientific training is not separate from spiritual truth. It is another path toward understanding. The plant formations you documented, the temperature variations, the soil changes, they are physical manifestations of spiritual reality. Energy taking form, memory becoming matter. But how is any of this possible? Trauma creates lasting impressions, especially when it occurs during sacred ceremonies in places of power. The massacre interrupted rituals designed to strengthen the boundary between worlds. Instead, our violent deaths tore that boundary open, creating a permanent wound that influences physical reality." Running Deer gestured toward the forest surrounding the clearing. "This entire area is affected. Animals avoid it. Plants grow in patterns that reflect our pain, and those who would exploit the land find themselves unable to do so. We protect this place through our continued presence, even as we seek justice for our murders." The spirit began to fade as the moon moved higher. "Be careful, Dr. Coronacion. Dr. Whitmore's patience is ending, and he will soon move beyond threats." But know that you are not alone. The land itself fights with you, and the dead remember those who remember us. As running deer disappeared, the geometric plants dimmed to their normal luminescence, and the temperature returned to normal. But Trisha could still feel the presence of the 17 spirits, watching and waiting for someone brave enough to expose the truth that had cost them their lives. She walked back to her car with new understanding of the forces arrayed against her. This wasn't just about a property dispute or local corruption. She was caught between the living descendants of murderers and the restless spirits of their victims. With justice hanging in the balance, the question was whether she had the courage to see the confrontation through to its inevitable conclusion. Thomas Crow Feather was waiting for Trisha at the motel when she returned from her supernatural encounter. He sat in his pickup truck with the engine off, his weathered hands resting on the steering wheel as he watched her approach. "You went to the clearing tonight," he said as she reached his window. "It wasn't a question, she spoke to me. Running deer. She told me about the ceremony, about how the murders created a permanent wound in reality." Trisha's voice carried the strain of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally altered. "She also told me that Sarah Chen was her descendant." Thomas nodded gravely. "Then you're ready to hear the complete truth. Get in." They drove through the darkened countryside to a small cabin hidden deep in the forest. Solar panels and a wind generator suggested off-grid living, while the gardens surrounding the structure showed the kind of careful cultivation that spoke of traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Inside, the cabin was simply furnished but filled with books, maps and photographs documenting decades of research. Thomas gestured toward a wall covered with genealogical charts and historical documents. "My people have been keeping records since the massacre," he began. "Not just of what happened that day, but of every consequence that followed. The cover-up, the subsequent murders, the way the conspiracy evolved over 150 years. The genealogical charts showed family trees for the prominent Millbrook families, with red marks indicating those who had participated in the original massacre, and black marks for those who had died under suspicious circumstances while investigating the clearing." Dr. James. Whitmore's ancestor, Samuel Whitmore, was the one who organized the false peace meeting, Thomas continued. He convinced the other town leaders that eliminating the remaining Seneca was necessary for the community's prosperity. The land they occupied was valuable, and the spiritual significance of the clearing made it impossible to purchase or simply steal. Thomas pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This belonged to Edmund Henley, Margaret's great-grandfather. He kept detailed records of the conspiracy, including his own guilt over what they'd done. Trisha read passages that described the careful planning of the massacre. The conspirators had studied Seneca customs to identify the most sacred ceremony, then extended an invitation that couldn't be refused without violating spiritual obligations. They'd waited until the ritual was at its most sacred moment before opening fire, maximizing both the psychological and spiritual trauma. 17 people died that day, Thomas said quietly. Spiritual leaders, healers, young people who represented the future of our community. Their murders weren't just crimes against individuals. They were an attack on our entire spiritual tradition. But the journal also documented the immediate consequences of the massacre. Within days, people began disappearing in and around the clearing. Workers hired to bury the bodies never returned from their task. Land surveyors sent to map the property vanished without trace. The ground itself seemed to reject any attempt at development or exploitation. The conspirators realized they'd created something beyond their control, Thomas explained. The spiritual significance of the site, combined with the trauma of the murders, had torn open a permanent pathway between worlds. The dead weren't gone. They were trapped in a state between life and death, unable to rest until justice was served. Edmund Henley's later entries showed growing paranoia and guilt. He described dreams where the massacre victims spoke to him, demanding acknowledgement of their murders. He wrote of geometric patterns appearing in his own garden, of plants that grew in shapes that seemed to spell out accusations in languages he couldn't read. The guilt drove him to document everything, Thomas said. He believed that if the truth was ever exposed, his cooperation might earn him some measure of forgiveness. But he never found the courage to come forward during his lifetime. Thomas showed her photographs spanning the decades, images of the clearing taken at different times, showing how the supernatural phenomena had evolved and intensified. The geometric plant formations had appeared gradually, becoming more complex and precise over time. The impossible species had arrived one by one, each representing an aspect of the spiritual world, bleeding through into physical reality. But the living conspirators didn't sit idle, Thomas continued. They developed a systematic approach to protecting their secret. Anyone who showed too much interest in the clearing, anyone who asked inconvenient questions about local history, anyone who might potentially expose the truth, they were eliminated. A detailed chart showed the 17 deaths over 150 years, each one carefully orchestrated to appear accidental or natural. Investigators who got too close to the truth were found dead of apparent heart attacks. Researchers were killed in car accidents that left no witnesses. Graduate students and historians simply disappeared, their bodies never found. The methods evolved with the times, Thomas explained. In the 1800s, they used crude violence, shootings or beatings that could be attributed to random crime. By the 1900s, they'd learned to stage more sophisticated accidents. Now they use techniques that leave no forensic evidence, untraceable poisons, mechanical failures, medical emergencies that can't be questioned. Thomas pulled out a recent photograph showing Sarah Chen's car being pulled from the river. Sarah was my great-niece, though she didn't know it. Her family had been relocated during the Indian removal era, and the connection to running deer had been lost. But blood calls to blood, and the land recognized her when she began researching indigenous sites. How did Dr. Whitmore know she was a threat? Trisha asked. Because his family has been monitoring anyone who researches indigenous history in this region. They have contacts in universities, government agencies, even genealogical organizations. When Sarah started asking questions about sacred sites that had been disturbed during settlement, she triggered alerts they'd established decades ago. Thomas revealed stolen emails proving Dr. Whitmore's network had monitored Sarah Chen's research before orchestrating her accident. Forced off the river road, her death had been staged to look natural. Trisha, horrified, demanded federal involvement, but Thomas explained the conspiracy reached into federal agencies themselves. Whitmore sat on advisory boards, shielding the crimes of his ancestors and allies. Their only hope lay in the supernatural witnesses, the massacre's restless spirits. Days later, Helen Chen arrived in Millbrook, posing as her dead twin. Meeting Trisha in a diner, she produced photos and tire mark analysis proving Sarah's car had been rammed. Helen's own investigation revealed Whitmore's deep web of influence, political allies, corporate ties, and payoffs to officials. Together, the women began mapping a conspiracy built over 150 years. Their work drew attention. A van loitered outside. Deputy Maria Santos entered, reciting accusations of trespass and harassment clearly scripted by others. Yet she privately warned them of danger and handed over a flash drive, files documenting 17 suspicious deaths tied to the clearing. "Your sister was murdered," she admitted, "and you're next unless this is exposed." Soon after, Whitmore confronted them in the diner, flanked by men blocking the exits. Smiling coldly, he dismissed their research as local folklore and warned outsiders often met tragic accidents. The threat was unmistakable. Helen whispered they had less than 48 hours. That night, Trisha returned to the clearing to document plant anomalies. Whitmore and 6 armed men trapped her under spotlights, declaring she would be the 18th accident. But the clearing rebelled. Frost spreading, ghostly voices rising, Seneca spirits manifesting. Running Deer, leader among them, proclaimed, "The cycle of violence ends tonight." Santos arrived with sirens blaring, weapon drawn. Whitmore tried to frame the women as agitators, but she revealed federal backup was en route, summoned through Helen's contacts. Helicopters soon roared overhead, and Whitmore's men were arrested as the spirits bore silent witness. The FBI's arrival transformed Millbrook into the center of a massive federal investigation. Forensic teams uncovered mass graves beneath the geometric plant formations, living memorials grown from the massacre itself. Financial records and testimony proved a continuous conspiracy spanning 6 generations. Sarah Chen's murder tied the past to the present. Legal justice was only part of the reckoning. Thomas Crow Feather organized ceremonies to honor the 17 victims, whose spirits finally faded into peace. The land, once a site of trauma, was restored to tribal stewardship as a memorial. Whitmore and his co-conspirators were sentenced to life, their network dismantled. Helen founded a non-profit to pursue cold cases of indigenous injustice. Santos became sheriff, committed to transparency. Trisha, blending science with traditional knowledge, built her herbal practice beside the memorial. A year later, the clearing thrived with native plants and quiet peace. What began with a 60-cent land purchase had become a reckoning across centuries, proving that truth, however buried, cannot be silenced. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.